Andy Gibb was living faster than almost anyone of his generation. He shattered records as the first solo artist whose first 3 singles went straight to #1. He was everywhere at once, on the charts, on television, on red carpets, dating one of the most famous actresses in America, smiling as if the momentum would never slow. Then, before the decade even turned, he was gone, just 30 years old. The story the world accepted was simple and brutal: drugs, heartbreak, self-destruction. It was easier to believe that than to look closer. But while the headlines settled and the rumors hardened into facts, one person stayed silent. His daughter, Peter. For nearly 4 decades, she watched strangers rewrite her father's life and death, turning pain into gossip and loss into myth. She heard the whispers about suicide. She saw his name reduced to a cautionary tale, and she said nothing. Until now, in 2024, the silence finally broke. And what she reveals forces a very different look at who Andy Gibb really was, and what actually destroyed him. What she revealed about her father's final years stunned even the people who thought they knew him best. This is the story that was never meant to surface, the one buried beneath headlines, assumptions, and decades of silence. Andy Gibb entered the world on March 5, 1958, in a modest hospital in Manchester, born into a family where music wasn't just a passion, it was the air they breathed. His father had once been a drummer and big band leader. His mother carried a quiet strength shaped by her Irish and English roots, and their home was filled with rhythm long before Andy could walk. He was the youngest of 5, arriving after the bond between his older brothers Barry, Robin, and Morris had already begun to form, a bond that would soon transform them into the Bee Gees and change popular music forever. Just 6 months after Andy was born, the family uprooted their lives and boarded a ship called the Fair Sea, sailing to Australia in September 1958 under an assisted migration scheme. They settled first in Redcliffe, then Crib Island, then Brisbane, then Sydney. Andy barely had time to recognize one place before it disappeared behind him. Moving became normal, starting over became routine, and while his brothers were already appearing on television and cutting early recordings, Andy was absorbing everything quietly. Growing up on the edges of a musical phenomenon he was too young to join but too close to escape when Andy was 8. The family returned to England in January 1967, and the contrast was overwhelming. The world he stepped into was louder, faster, and charged with expectation. Crowds gathered daily outside their London home. His brothers were no longer just musicians, they were international stars. At school, Andy struggled to adjust. Classmates assumed his life was easy because of his last name, not realizing how heavy that shadow felt when it wasn't yours to stand in. Fame surrounded him, but it didn't belong to him, and that distinction cut deeper than anyone noticed. Those early years never really left him. His childhood was a blur of suitcases, new classrooms, and the constant feeling of being the new kid. Between 1961 and the mid-1960s, the family lived in multiple places: Northgate, Surfers Paradise, Sydney, each move resetting his world. While his brothers were honing their craft under pressure and attention, Andy watched from the sidelines, learning by observation rather than immersion. By the time they returned to England, the gap between him and his brothers wasn't just age. Barry was more than 11 years older, Robin and Morris more than 8. They were men with a shared history. Andy was a child trying to find his footing. Back in England, he was surrounded by noise, admiration, and expectations he couldn't meet yet. Suggestions that he join his brothers were dismissed. He was too young, too inexperienced. School offered little refuge. Teasing followed him, sharpened by envy and misunderstanding. Still, he reached for something that felt like his own. At 13, Barry gave him a guitar. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it changed everything. Andy held it like an anchor. He practiced late into the night, not trying to become the next Bee Gee, but trying to become himself. The guitar gave him a voice when words failed, a place where comparison didn't matter. That guitar went with him when he left England. In the early 1970s, at just 14, Andy was performing in noisy tourist clubs, places where the crowds were unpredictable and the nights unforgiving. Those stages were rough, but they were his. There, he could experiment, make mistakes, and grow without the constant weight of his family name pressing down on him. It was the first time Andy Gibb felt like he wasn't living in someone else's echo, but building something that belonged to him alone. He played whatever the room demanded: pop covers, half-finished originals, familiar melodies bent into something personal. Night after night, he learned how to read a crowd, how to hold attention, how to make strangers feel close. Those long, exhausting evenings taught him confidence the hard way. By the end of 1973, he wasn't just surviving on stage anymore. He had a small but loyal following and, more importantly, a growing belief that he didn't need to live in his brother's shadow. Ibiza shaped him in ways nothing else could. It taught him independence, resilience, and the quiet certainty that his path did not have to mirror anyone else's. In 1974, at just 15, Andy chose another fresh beginning and moved to Sydney to live with his sister Leslie. The change felt immediate and profound. He later described Sydney as his spiritual home, a place filled with warmth, openness, and possibility. For the first time, he felt free. He lived simply, shared small apartments, and spent his days writing songs and playing wherever someone would let him plug in a guitar. The Australian music scene was alive and unpretentious, and Andy fit into it naturally. Here, he wasn't the youngest Gibb. He was simply Andy, a young musician carving out his own identity. The club circuit began to open doors. Cole Joy, one of Australia's early rock and roll pioneers, recognized Andy's raw talent and took him under his wing. From 1974 to 1976, Andy performed constantly around Sydney, playing hotels and clubs with his first real group, Melody Fair. The band, which included Isle of Man musicians John Alderson and John Stringer, gave him something invaluable: repetition, discipline, and the grind of earning every applause. In November 1974, Andy recorded 6 demo tracks with Cole Joy, including Words and Music, Westfield Mansions, and Flowing Rivers. These weren't imitation songs or placeholders. They were the first clear expressions of Andy's own voice. While the Bee Gees dominated charts around the world, Andy stayed grounded in small venues with modest pay, learning how to connect without leaning on a famous last name. At 16, he reached a turning point when he wrote Words and Music, his first commercial single, released in late 1975 in Australia and New Zealand. It wasn't a massive hit, but it didn't need to be. It proved something far more important. Andy could write, record, and stand on his own. The song gave him confidence and marked the beginning of a new chapter, one built on self-belief rather than comparison. By 1976, the pieces were finally coming together. In June of that year, Barry called and urged Andy to move to Miami. Andy didn't hesitate for long. At 18, he made a whirlwind decision and married Kim Rear on July 11, 1976, at the Wayside Chapel in Sydney. Their honeymoon led straight into music history. They stayed at Robert Stigwood's house in Bermuda, where Barry joined them to begin shaping Andy's debut album. By September, Andy and Kim arrived in Miami. Stepping directly into the creative world that surrounded the Bee Gees' Criteria Studios was alive with energy. The Eagles were there finishing Hotel California, and the air felt charged with ambition and possibility. Andy walked into that studio aware of the weight of where he stood, but ready. Recording for Flowing Rivers began in October 1976. Built largely from songs Andy had written during his Australian years, Joe Walsh played on 2 tracks, adding another layer of credibility and excitement. Barry produced only 2 songs but guided the project as executive producer, while Albie Galutin and Carl Richardson shaped the album's sound. The sessions moved quickly, filled with live band takes, rich strings, and horns that gave the record warmth and depth. When Flowing Rivers was released in September 1977, it confirmed what Andy had been working toward for years. The album reached the top 20 on Billboard's Top 200 and sold over 1 million copies. It wasn't just a successful debut, it was proof that Andy Gibb had arrived on his own terms, not as an extension of his brother's legacy, but as a star in his own right. For a debut artist, what happened next bordered on unbelievable. Success didn't arrive gradually. It crashed into Andy's life all at once. His first single, I Just Want to Be Your Everything, shot to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on July 30, 1977, and stayed there for 4 weeks. Andy was only 19 years old, making him the youngest solo male artist ever to reach that position. Before the shock could even settle, his second single, Love Is Thicker Than Water, followed the same path, hitting number 1 in March 1978, and in a moment that felt almost symbolic, it replaced his brother's Staying Alive at the top of the chart. For a brief, extraordinary moment, the entire Gibb family stood at the summit of pop music together. Andy had done something rare, something historic. His rise was fast, brilliant, and undeniable, and while it placed crushing expectations on his shoulders, it also proved beyond question that he was more than just the youngest. Gibb. Andy moved into the winter of 1977 with momentum that refused to slow down. Once he stepped into studios in Los Angeles and Miami, everything began moving at a relentless pace that pulled him forward whether he was ready or not. Recording for his second album, Shadow Dancing, began in December and wrapped by February 1978. The same creative circles surrounded him again. Barry Gibb, Albie Galutin, and Carl Richardson were never far, drifting in and out of sessions, sometimes straight from nearby movie sets where the Bee Gees were filming Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Sessions shifted between Wally Heider Studios in Los Angeles and Criteria Studios in Miami, blending into one long and exhausting creative stretch that barely paused for breath. The band behind Andy was so tight they jokingly referred to themselves as the Andy Gibb Hit Orchestra. Harold Cowart anchored the bass, Ron Ziegler locked in the drums, and Joey Mercier handled guitar with effortless precision. Barry escaped the film set whenever he could. Albie often worked until sunrise, and the Atlantic Records rhythm section gave the tracks a pulse that felt unmistakably alive. Everything was built piece by piece, moving between cities, chasing that Miami Beach disco groove that made the album feel urgent and modern. When the title track Shadow Dancing was released in April 1978, the reaction was immediate. The single surged up the Billboard Hot 100, reached number 1 on June 17, and stayed there for 7 consecutive weeks. That became the biggest single of 1978, selling more than 2.5 million copies in the United States alone. At just 20 years old, Andy Gibb became the first solo artist in history to have his first 3 singles reach number 1. The achievement was so overwhelming it even outperformed the Bee Gees' own massive hits that same year, surpassing Staying Alive and Night Fever on the year-end charts. Suddenly, Andy wasn't a promising newcomer or a talented sibling. He was a star in his own right, and his name was everywhere. The album followed closely behind. Shadow Dancing climbed to number 7 on the Billboard 200 in the United States, performed just as strongly in Canada, and became the only one of Andy's albums to chart in the United Kingdom. Sales pushed it into multi-platinum territory. 2 more singles cracked the top 10. An Everlasting Love reached number 5, and Our Love Don't Throw It All Away reached number 9. Teen magazines flooded newsstands with his face. Radio stations played him constantly. His image was carefully shaped by managers and publicists, polished, warm, and endlessly approachable. But carrying that image came at a cost. The pressure intensified, and the spotlight followed him everywhere, even when he didn't feel steady beneath it. Behind the charts and screaming crowds, Andy's personal life was already straining under the weight of everything happening at once. He had married Kim Reeder in Sydney on July 11, 1976, when he was still preparing for a career that would soon explode beyond control. Their daughter, Peter J., was born on January 25, 1978, right as Andy reached the absolute height of his fame. The timing made everything harder. He was barely out of his teens, navigating sudden superstardom, constant travel, and relentless expectations. There was never enough space to slow down, and never enough time to be fully present. Even as the world celebrated him, Andy was already beginning to feel pulled apart by the life he was racing to keep up with. But, according to Kim, Andy's first passion was cocaine. Their marriage broke down as a result of him being aloof and suspicious. January 15, 1978, was the date of their divorce, just 10 days prior to Peter's birth. Although Kim claimed it was never about money, reporters portrayed her as someone who was after it. After she returned to Australia, the gap between Andy and his child widened and remained significant for years. Andy entered another relationship shortly after, which would garner even more attention. He started dating Marie Osmond in 1978. From the beginning, according to producer Albie Galutin, it seemed impossible because Marie didn't even drink soda and Andy was heavily involved in narcotics. Things got worse when Andy bombarded Marie with incessant late-night phone calls, and her family disapproved. Eventually, her family intervened and filed a lawsuit to prevent him from phoning. Later on, Marie said that she regretted sending a direct phone message to end the relationship. That moment struck him like a wall he couldn't scale when she told him they were finished. The relationship was slipping away from her. It turned into yet another wound that he was unable to heal. Years later, she talked about how she was afraid of losing herself if she continued to attempt to save him. She still recalls him with respect and regret. Victoria Principal then arrived. On the John Davidson Show in 1981, they first crossed paths. She was already a Dallas star at the age of 31, and at the age of 23, Andy's smile continued to brighten spaces. In pictures, they looked stunning together. They went on to become one of Hollywood's most successful couples for 13 months. On the inside, though Andy's addiction was getting worse, for as long as she could, Victoria hung on. She wanted him to choose sobriety, but he was unable to do so. She offered him the option to choose between drugs and her. The drugs were his choice. They were both broken by it. No matter how much she loved him, she argued, she couldn't sacrifice her own life for his addiction. During this period, their duet, All I Have to Do Is Dream, was released and turned into his last hit. It got to number 51. He remembered that number. The heartbreak did too. The difficulty was evident by 1980. When Andy completed his third album, After Dark, the indicators were picked up by producers. He was sinking more quickly. His performances were erratic as the addiction tugged at all he attempted. The record didn't have the same level of popularity as his previous projects. He may have been able to handle that on its own, but the addiction began to cost him jobs. Joseph, the incredible Technicolor Dreamcoat, and roles in The Pirates of Penzance slipped away. He missed Solid Gold's hosting opportunity. In the midst of this turmoil, Victoria's ultimatum struck. The poor performance of the album was like another door closing, and every door that closed caused him to become more inward. He collapsed more deeply after the relationship ended in March 1982. It took place a few days prior to his 24th birthday. Despite his hopes for a future together, Victoria informed him that she did not want to marry him. She permanently left him when he didn't choose sobriety, and he never got over that incident. In interviews, he blamed her for his failure, believing that the separation had damaged him. No one around him could ignore the deterioration that began with her choice. Everything went south after the split. Andy told People magazine that he lost all sense of purpose and broke apart. He used cocaine constantly and spent roughly $1,000 a day, which is more than $3,000 in today's currency. Every aspect of his existence was consumed by the drug. producers were frantically attempting to get him back on track, but he refused to leave his room and remained up for 2 weeks in a row. As his stomach and chest issues worsened, he began to visit the hospital more frequently. It was discussed in whispers inside the profession, and eventually it was obvious that he was falling too far. The emotional breakdown was equally devastating. He was too broken to leave the house, so he missed important events like the American Music Awards. Almost immediately, he tried again. Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat on Broadway was a major opportunity, the kind of second chance most performers never receive. For a short while, hope returned. Then the pattern repeated. In just 6 weeks, Andy missed 12 performances. The understudy became the lead more often than he did. Producers Zev Buffman and Susan Ross confronted him directly. Andy pleaded. He promised change. He begged for one more chance. Then he missed another show. That absence ended everything. Another door closed, not from lack of talent, but from exhaustion with waiting. His family watched in helpless disbelief. They could see he knew what he was losing, yet couldn't stop himself. Andy moved next to the Los Angeles production of The Pirates of Penzance, clinging to the belief that this time would be different. It wasn't. Missed rehearsals returned. Reliability vanished again. When the show went on the road, Andy was left behind. Producers said plainly that they could no longer depend on him. This was now the third major project lost to the same battle. Whispers spread through the industry. The word unreliable followed his name. His family heard those whispers too, and they hurt more than the headlines. As his career unraveled, something even more devastating occurred. His voice began to fail. Years of drug use damaged his vocal cords, stripping away the smooth, effortless sound that had carried him into history. The change was unmistakable. His brothers, Barry, Robin, and Morris, tried to reach him, but every relapse widened the distance between them. They loved him fiercely, yet each broken promise carved deeper wounds. Marie Osmond later revealed she felt compelled to take legal action to stop the Bee Gees from financially supporting Andy, believing their help, however loving, was only enabling his destruction. It showed how desperate and tangled the situation had become, with everyone trying to save him in different ways, and no one knowing how. By 1985, the family forced one last intervention. Andy entered the Betty Ford Clinic, one of the most respected addiction treatment centers in the country. For 6 weeks, he lived within structure, therapy, and accountability. For the first time in years, hope felt real. He left believing he could begin again. But addiction does not release its grip easily. Depression followed him out the door. Self-hatred whispered louder than recovery. He relapsed once more, not because he didn't want to be well, but because he never fully learned how to live without the pain that had been driving him all along. The clinic had a strong recovery record, yet Andy became one of the many who struggled the moment the structure disappeared. His family felt the weight of that failure deeply, because they knew how badly he needed this one victory. Recovery was not just about health anymore. It was about survival, and as his emotional strength crumbled, the financial collapse followed close behind. In the late 1970s, Andy had earned millions. At his peak, he was paid $50,000 per show and made more than $3 million from shadow dancing alone. But cocaine burned through money as ruthlessly as it burned through his body. By 1985, his annual income had fallen to just over $24,000. In 1986, it collapsed further to barely $7,000. The fall was not gradual. It was brutal. Bills piled up as opportunities vanished. By September 1987, Andy filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The documents told a devastating story. His total assets amounted to just $1,432.79. His debts exceeded $1 million before later. Amendments adjusted the total to just under $188,000. Either way, the reality was the same. He had nothing left. He was living rent-free in a Florida penthouse owned by his brothers, surrounded by borrowed furniture. Fame had not just faded, it had evaporated, leaving him exposed, embarrassed, and fragile. The bankruptcy filing laid everything bare. Dated September 10, 1987, it listed over $1 million in personal and business debts. A single law firm was owed nearly $40,000. Business jet airlines appeared on the list with more than $23,000 owed. There were medical bills, unpaid taxes, accounting fees, and legal costs stacked on top of one another. Even his own management company was listed, with more than $46,000 in debt and only a few $100s in assets. The court allowed him to keep just $1,000 in personal property. The man who once ruled the charts had no safety net left. His daughter received no financial security from the father who had once seemed unstoppable. Still, Andy tried one more time. In January 1988, he traveled to England after Island Records expressed interest in giving him another chance. Barry helped arrange the opportunity. All Andy had to do was show up and sign the contract. But anxiety overtook him the moment he arrived. He missed meetings. He avoided conversations. He began to believe he had nothing left to offer. The contract was never signed. The album never began. His confidence collapsed under the weight of everything he had lost. He did manage to record a handful of sessions at Mayfair Studios in the spring of 1988, but addiction and fear were stronger than momentum. Berry and Morris called often, urging him to stay clean, trying to keep him anchored. Every missed opportunity felt heavier than the last, because everyone knew this might be the final one. Yet even in the middle of that chaos, Andy still carried quiet dreams. In 1987, he earned a pilot's license, something almost no one knew at the time. It surprised people later, because it revealed a part of him that still wanted a future beyond music. He talked privately about flying, about starting fresh, even about possibly joining the Bee Gees on their 1989 album. Berry later said Andy had a quiet determination that most people never saw. That pilot's license became a small, hidden symbol of hope, proof that he had not completely given up on life. Everything collapsed in March 1988. After celebrating his 30th birthday on March 5, his health worsened rapidly. He had checked himself into a hospital weeks earlier but left too soon. On March 7, he walked into the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford complaining of severe chest pains. Doctors wanted to run further tests, but before they could, Andy collapsed. On March 10, 1988, he never regained consciousness. The man who once stood at the top of the world was gone, leaving behind unanswered questions, unfinished dreams, and a silence that would linger for decades. The official cause was myocarditis, an inflamed heart muscle that had been weakened over years of substance abuse. His cardiologist, Dr. William Schell, later explained that Andy's heart simply could not fight anymore. He had been sober for more than a year, but the damage was already done. Fans were stunned because Andy had been talking about new music, about starting again. His family felt the loss like a final, cruel blow, because they truly believed he was close to turning a corner. Just 5 days after his 30th birthday, Andy Gibb was gone. His death followed 3 hospital visits in a matter of weeks, warning signs that came too fast and too late. On the night of March 9, he collapsed at his brother Robin's estate and was rushed back to the hospital. By the time the news broke, the world struggled to understand how someone so young, so gifted, and so hopeful could disappear so quickly. He had been sober. He had been trying, but the body could not undo years of strain. The story did not end with his death. Andy left behind one daughter, Peter, who was only 10 years old at the time. Because he left no will, she inherited nothing. For most of her childhood, she knew her father not as a constant presence, but as a distant voice on the phone, a man who appeared briefly and vanished again. As the years passed, rumors began to circulate, including the false claim that Andy had taken his own life. They were untrue, but they lingered, adding another layer of pain to an already fragile legacy. In 2024, Peter Gibb finally spoke publicly for the first time. What she said changed everything. She explained that her father did not die from heart disease alone. He died, she said, because he hated himself. Her words reframed his entire story, revealing a man crushed not just by addiction, but by shame, self-doubt, and unresolved pain. Behind the headlines and chart statistics was someone who struggled deeply to believe he was worthy of the life he was given. That same year, Peter launched the official Andy Gibb website, calling it a labor of love. She filled it with photographs, letters, and memories the public had never seen. For the first time, she took control of her father's story, not to glorify the fall, but to honor the truth. The Gibb family supported her, and fans responded with gratitude and compassion. Through her work, Andy Gibb returned to the light, not as a cautionary tale, but as a human being who loved deeply, dreamed endlessly, and fought battles he never learned how to win.